Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and the cost of absolutely everything, your commute, your groceries, the electricity keeping your lights on, even your mortgage has just jumped by like 15% overnight.
Yeah, which is a terrifying thought.
Right. And this isn't because of a new local tax or, I don't know, some slow shift in the domestic economy. It is literally because a single industrial facility sitting 6,000 miles away in the desert went up in flames over the weekend.
Exactly.
So today, we are looking at exactly how a localized military strike in the Middle East has mathematically triggered this instantaneous global economic shockwave. Welcome to this deep dive.
Thanks for having me. We're really dissecting a massive, rapidly escalating geopolitical event today. Our mission is to take these incredibly dense, breaking Reuters reports from today, March 19, 2026, and kind of untangle the complex mechanics of it all.
Right. How this U.S.-Israeli conflict with Iran has fundamentally morphed from just a regional military exchange into a paralyzing global energy crisis.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're looking at.
And because the politics surrounding this conflict are obviously so volatile, we want to set some ground rules with you right at the top. We are strictly separating the political rhetoric from the on-the-ground reality today.
Very important distinction.
Yeah, we aren't here to take a political stance. We're not validating either side's military strategy or, ideological viewpoints. We are just looking at the raw data, the physical damage and the official statements laid out in the reporting to understand what is actually happening to the global grid and, honestly, why it's going to hit your wallet.
Right. It's really about cutting through the fog of war to see the mechanical gears turning underneath.
Yeah.
Because you can't understand the financial panic sweeping global markets today without first visualizing the physical destruction of the infrastructure that actually powers those markets.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the chain reaction here is staggering. Let's look at the catalyst first. The initial domino to fall in this specific escalation was Israel bombing Iran's South Pars gas field. But the immediate severe retaliation for that strike didn't just hit back at a military base. It struck the very heart of the global energy supply. Tell us about the Iranian response.
Well, Iran lashed out at Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city. And we really need to pause and establish the scale of Ras Laffan because it is an absolute titan of global energy.
Okay.
This single complex processes around a fifth of the world's entire supply of liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
A fifth of the entire world supply, just in one place.
Exactly. So when the Iranian strike hit, it didn't just cause superficial damage. The CEO of Qatar Energy actually confirmed that this knocked out a full sixth of Qatar's entire LNG export capacity in just a matter of minutes.
Wow. A sixth of their capacity just vaporized.
Yeah. And the financial metric attached to that destruction is incredibly stark.
Okay.
It equates to a $20 billion a year loss.
Jeez, $20 billion.
Yeah. And it gets worse. It'll take 3 to 5 years to repair.
Wait, I have to stop you there. I don't understand that timeline. Why half a decade? I mean, if a pipeline blows up, you send in a crew, you weld a new pipe, and you turn the valve back on, right? Why is a localized strike taking 3 to 5 years to fix?
Well, that is the crucial difference between standard oil infrastructure and liquefied natural gas infrastructure.
Yeah.
You aren't just dealing with hollow steel pipes.
Okay.
LNG liquefaction trains, which is what these processing units are called, they're massive, bespoke, highly complex cryogenic engineering marvels. They're designed to take raw gas and supercool it down to minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit.
Minus 260. Wow.
Yeah, so it condenses into a liquid that can actually be put on a ship.
So it's essentially a massive, highly pressurized, custom-built freezer.
Precisely. The compressors, the heat exchangers, the specialized turbines. You cannot just order replacement parts for these on Amazon. They are custom manufactured from scratch for each specific facility. So when a drone or a missile destroys a liquefaction train, you have to completely re-engineer and rebuild that highly sensitive equipment. That is why a 10-minute air raid literally erases 5 years of economic output.
That completely changes the context. I mean, I keep thinking of the global energy market like a tightly woven spider web. You touch one thread and the whole thing shakes violently.
That's a great way to put it.
But wait, the sources also mention strikes outside of Qatar, right? How widespread is this shaking?
The web is shaking everywhere. The retaliation was geographically sprawling. Let's look at the cascading damages across the region. Saudi Arabia's main port on the Red Sea was attacked.
Oh, wow.
And this port is critical because Saudi Arabia had specifically been using it as a bypass, like a way to divert some of its exports away from other danger zones in the Gulf.
So they intentionally targeted the backup plan.
They did. They also hit oil facilities in Israel's port of Haifa, causing significant physical damage, though thankfully without casualties there. And moving down the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates was forced to completely shut down its Habshan gas facility due to the threat matrix. And fires were set off at 2 separate Kuwaiti oil refineries.
So Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE, Kuwait, this is a deliberate, region-wide targeting of the global energy nervous system.
It is. And what's fascinating here is a specific observation that really emerges from this pattern of destruction. These strikes don't merely demonstrate Iran's military reach, they underscore the sheer, profound limits of modern air defenses.
How so?
We're talking about the Gulf's most valuable, strategic, and hypercritical energy assets. These facilities are guarded by some of the most technologically advanced, well-funded militaries on the planet, using multi-billion-dollar shield systems.
And the shield still broke.
Exactly.
I mean, you can have all the Patriot missile batteries in the world, but if a swarm of relatively cheap drones slips through, it takes billions of dollars of infrastructure offline. But destroying that physical supply is really only half the crisis. The other half is weaponizing the geography itself. I mean, this massive geographical blockade. Even the gas and oil that survived these strikes is now essentially trapped.
Because of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, the ultimate bottleneck. The data shows that the Strait of Hormuz is the Gulf's exit point and the conduit for around a fifth of the entire world's oil supply.
Yeah, 1 in every 5 barrels of oil moving globally has to float through this narrow stretch of water.
And the joint statement from European nations and Japan notes that Iran has achieved a de facto closure of the strait.
Yes.
I need to push you on the mechanics of that phrase. De facto closure.
Yeah.
How does a country actually close international waters without, lining up a massive wall of naval destroyers?
Well, they do it through asymmetric area denial. You don't need a wall of ships to close the strait. You just need to alter the risk calculus for commercial shipping companies.
Okay.
The Strait of Hormuz is about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, but the actual deep-water shipping lanes are only 2 miles wide in either direction.
Wow, that's tiny.
Right. So Iran is enforcing this closure through a combination of severe threats, laying naval mines in those narrow lanes, and active drone and missile attacks on unarmed commercial vessels.
So it's an economic blockade as much as a physical one. If a shipping conglomerate knows there are active mines, the insurance premiums to send a tanker through that strait just become astronomically high. It's financially impossible to move the cargo.
Exactly. The ships simply refuse to enter. They drop anchor and wait. And the moment that happens, the global supply chain seizes up entirely.
So what does this all mean, specifically for you, the person listening to this right now? We have custom cryogenic facilities burning in Qatar and massive tankers sitting idle outside a heavily mined strait. How does that translate into an economic shockwave for the average person?
It translates mathematically and instantly. Because energy markets are globally integrated and incredibly reactive. When you suddenly wipe out a massive chunk of natural gas processing and trap a fifth of the world's oil behind a minefield, the price of whatever energy is left in the world skyrockets.
Makes sense.
The raw data on this is grim. Brent crude oil futures, which serve as the major benchmark for global oil prices, surged by up to 10% on the news before settling near $110.35 a barrel.
A 10% jump. And foundational energy costs dictate the price of everything.
Everything.
The cost to manufacture the plastic in your phone, the cost to run the diesel trucks delivering food to your supermarket, flying an airplane. Everything gets more expensive the second that oil barrel price jumps.
And the situation with natural gas is even more severe. European near-term gas prices jumped more than 15% just on the news of the Ras-Laffan strike alone.
Jeez.
And if we look at the broader timeline, those European gas prices have leapt by over 60% since this conflict began.
Over 60%. If the cost to power a heavy manufacturing plant in Germany or the UK goes up by 60%, the entire economy shudders. Factories have to shut down because they literally cannot afford to turn the machines on. And we are seeing that global market panic materializing right now. Japanese and South Korean stocks fell around 3%. The Pan-European stocks index dropped 2.3%, hitting its lowest point in over 3 months. And Wall Street wasn't immune either. The Dow Jones dropped about 1%.
Right. Investors are watching the physical destruction and immediately pricing in a global recession.
Yeah.
But The most insidious secondary effect here, the one that will really impact the listener's long-term financial health, is what this does to central banks.
Oh, right. The central bank whiplash? Explain the mechanics of that.
Well, we've all just lived through years of battling grueling inflation, right?
Yeah.
Central banks around the world were finally hoping to ease up to start cutting interest rates. But this energy crisis is causing massive whiplash.
Because they're paralyzed by an energy shock.
Exactly. Central banks use interest rates to control demand. If inflation is high because people are spending too much money, a central bank raises rates to make borrowing expensive, which cools down spending. But this is a supply shock. People aren't buying too much gas. The gas isn't there anymore. A central bank can raise interest rates all they want, but they cannot print more natural gas. They cannot dredge the Strait of Hormuz.
So they are completely trapped. They have to watch prices explode, but their only tool to fight it just makes life harder for average consumers.
That is the bind. The fear of lasting inflationary pressures has forced the European Central Bank and the Bank of England to hold their interest rates steady. Investors who expected rate cuts are now frantically bracing for rate hikes by the end of the year.
Wow.
The ECB actually had to officially revise its 2026 inflation prediction up to 2.6%.
That is a huge revision over a single weekend. But, as we pivot to the political reality managing this crisis, it feels like the geopolitical strategy driving this war is entirely chaotic.
Chaotic is really the only word for it. When global markets are in free fall, the international community looks for unified leadership. But the reporting reveals deep public fractures, particularly between the closest of allies.
Yeah, let's zero in on the United States and Israel because the disconnect is jarring. We have U.S. President Donald Trump speaking to reporters in the Oval Office, and he explicitly stated that he told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to repeat the attack on Iranian energy infrastructure.
Right.
The direct quote from Trump is, "I told him don't do that, and he won't do that."
The political calculus there is highly visible. A spike in domestic gas prices is politically toxic for any sitting U.S. president. He's publicly drawing a hard line to try and stop the bleeding at the pump.
But I have to push back here, or at least ask a question about the timeline. If the U.S. and Israel are allies fighting the same war, how did Israel bomb the South Pars gas field in the first place without the U.S. knowing? The sources mention major gaps in coordination.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the fundamentally differing objectives being stated by top U.S. officials.
Okay.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave a briefing claiming that U.S. objectives in the war are, quote, unchanged, on target, and on plan.
Okay, projecting control.
Right. But then, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard explicitly testified before the House Intelligence Committee that their goals actually differ.
Differ how?
She laid it out very clearly. Israel is focused almost entirely on disabling the Iranian leadership. The U.S., however, has a completely different target set. They want to destroy Iran's ballistic missile launching capabilities and essentially destroy their navy.
And those are two totally different wars. Taking out leadership requires precise intelligence and targeted strikes on bunkers. Dismantling a navy and a ballistic missile program requires broad, sustained infrastructure warfare.
Exactly. You cannot coordinate a unified defense if the two primary militaries have totally different endgames.
And there's troop confusion, too, right? I mean, a U.S. official claimed Trump was considering sending thousands more U.S. troops to the region. But then in a meeting with Japanese PM Sanaya Takeichi, Trump explicitly said he has no plans to deploy ground forces.
Right. The defense establishment is planning for escalation, while the president is publicly attempting to shut the door on ground involvement. And while this is playing out, Iran is issuing a chillingly clear ultimatum.
Yeah, what is their red line right now?
Iran's military spokesman, Ibrahim Zulfikari, announced that this is a new stage in the war. He stated that any further strikes will result in attacks on U.S. and allied energy infrastructure until it is, and this is a direct quote, completely destroyed.
Completely destroyed. So we have the U.S. and Israel misaligned, erratic messaging on troops, and Iran promising total energy warfare. With all this happening, the rest of the world is just scrambling to figure out how to respond.
Which brings us to the scramble for a diplomatic solution. A coalition trying to issue an ultimatum.
Right, the joint statement. The reporting details a joint statement issued by Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan. They united to condemn Iran's attacks, and they demanded compliance with UN Security Council Resolution 2817. And they also cited the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to defend freedom of navigation. What are their actual proposed solutions, though?
Well, they expressed a readiness to secure safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. They also welcomed the International Energy Agency's release of strategic petroleum reserves, trying to artificially lower the price.
Yeah.
And they pledged to work with producing nations to increase output to stabilize markets.
Okay, so on paper, that sounds robust. But here's where it gets really interesting, because there is a glaring caveat to all these promises.
Oh, yes.
German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stated that any actual contribution to securing the strait would only come after hostilities ended. Isn't that like promising to send the fire department only after the house is completely burned down?
It is a remarkable geopolitical paradox, but it stems from a stark reality. Major European powers and Japan are resisting entanglement in a highly volatile war with unclear objectives.
Right.
It's a war they didn't seek, and crucially, one over which they have absolutely zero operational control. They cannot steer the military strategy, so they refuse to commit their navies to the crossfire.
So they are just economic hostages, powerless to stop the military escalation causing this. Meanwhile, EU leaders are desperately meeting in Brussels,
Right.
just trying to figure out how to offset the rising cost of living for their citizens.
Exactly. They're trying to find the budget to subsidize the financial pain of a war they cannot stop.
It is a masterclass in globalized helplessness. Let's quickly recap the sheer speed of what we've unpacked today. A regional military strike cascaded into a global energy and economic crisis in days. It exposed deep rifts in military alliances and the terrifying fragility of international trade routes.
And this raises an important question, a concept I really want the listener to mull over.
Okay, what is it?
Building on that point about the limits of air defenses. If the world's most advanced military alliances, using the most sophisticated air defense systems ever conceived, are entirely incapable of protecting the massive, localized facilities that process a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas, is the entire concept of global energy security just an illusion that can be shattered by a single drone strike.
Wow. We like to think of the global economy as this impenetrable, abstract machine. But maybe it's just a fragile physical assembly line after all. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. As always, keep questioning the information around you, and we'll see you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.